The string section is the backbone of the orchestra and potentially the most versatile and expressive portion of it. The string section has an enormous range with 7 octaves, but despite that, the tone color actually stays fairly consistent throughout their register with very small nuances. It also has a huge dynamic range and is very versatile when it comes to producing different kinds of sounds. An added bonus is that the playing is not influenced by the player's breathing, unlike wind instruments where you have to take that into account. The section itself consists of violins, violas, celli, and basses, and a full symphony orchestra string section on average consists of 16 to 18 first violins, 14 to 16 second violins, 10 to 12 violas, 10 to 12 cellos, and 8 to 10 basses. The violin, the viola, and the cello are tuned in fifths, whereas the basses are tuned in fourths. In most film sessions, the basses also come with a C extension, and the basses are also the only instrument in the string section that are transposing instruments. They sound an octave lower than they're notated. The violins are notated in treble clef. In German, we also call it the G clef, or the violin clef actually. The violas are notated in the alto clef. In German, we also call it the viola clef, or the C clef. And the cellos and basses are notated in bass clef. Also in German, we refer to it as the F clef, I think. You can also notate consistently high passages in the cellos in tenor clef, or even treble clef, but that's definitely reserved for more uncommon situations. In order to produce a standard melody or tone on these instruments, you press down with your left hand fingers on the fingerboard, you press down the strings, while the right hand draws a bow across the strings. A professional string player can also play more than one note at a time by drawing the bow across 2 adjacent strings simultaneously. Those are called double stops. They can also play 3 notes at the same time, a triple stop, by basically drawing the bow across 3 strings at the same time, but then they have to, since the lineup of the strings is curved, they have to push down onto the middle string in order to reach the other 2. And that leads to, loud dynamics having to be played. So if you want a triple stop in a soft dynamic, then they would have to arpeggiate the 3 notes slightly. And they can also play quadruple stops, but those always have to be arpeggiated. Be careful though, because not all double, triple, and quadruple stops are possible. So if you're going to be writing extensively with that technique in mind, you should probably let an actual string player look over the passage, or a very experienced orchestrator, to make sure that it's actually playable. A much easier way to divide lines within the string orchestra is Divisi. You have so many players available that you can easily subdivide them into subsections, and then just have them play the individual lines. If you know exactly how many string players you have available, you can also very specifically indicate how many players you want on each line. But otherwise, if it's not indicated at film scoring sessions, they will mostly split themselves evenly, and then after doing a take, they might readjust their numbers if something was out of balance. As mentioned in one of my orchestration videos, be careful when you divisi and you have a very small string section, because you always want at least 3 players on each individual line. Otherwise, you're getting tuning issues, and it also doesn't necessarily sound like a section. So in order to be effective with divisi, make sure you have enough players on each individual line. Also make sure that after a divisi passage is done, that you write unisoni or tutti or something like that to indicate that everybody's playing together again. An important part of string playing is, of course, the bowing. You have a so-called up bow, meaning tip to frog into that direction, and you have a down bow, meaning frog to tip into that direction. Also be aware that there are natural dynamics that come with the bowing, meaning the further you move away from where you hold the bow with your hand, you get a natural diminuendo in a way. So if the players are playing a line with a diminuendo at the end, it's probably going to be a bow, a down bow, because there's less pressure on the tip of the bow. Likewise, if you have a crescendo, they're likely to use it the other way around because the pressure increases with where your hand is, namely at the frog. But only write bowing into your film scores if you want something very specific. Normally the concertmaster or also the section leaders will come in early before a session, and they will sit down, go through the music of the day and put down bowings and decide on the most efficient and musical way of doing it. So we don't necessarily tell them how to do this, and they will distribute that information throughout their section and let everybody know how they're going to be doing that later. So unless you want something really specific, like a repeated bite down of a down bow, or anything where you're very, very clear in what you want to achieve, just don't put bowings into your scores. The usual placement of the bow is in the middle between the fingerboard and the bridge, but there are also unusual placements of the bow. You have sul tasto, which means on the fingerboard, which gives you kind of a flute-like, soft whispering sound. Then you have flautando, which is almost the same. It technically means right before the fingerboard, not on the fingerboard, but just really close to it. The effect that this achieves sound-wise is kind of almost the same. I can't really hear the difference very well, so a lot of composers actually use the terms interchangeably, flautando and sul tasto, even though by definition they don't mean the same. And then you have sul Ponticello, which is basically the opposite. You play as far away as possible from the fingerboard near the bridge. And this creates a kind of eerie, cold, glassy timbre because certain partials of the tone that is being produced are very audible, that are normally not as audible. And then you have col legno, which means you turn around the bow. You don't play the string with the hairs, but you play it with the wood part of the bow. You can either hit the strings to get a percussive effect, or you can actually even drag the bow across the strings. Just be aware, you want to give your players a heads up if they have to do that, because their professional players' bows are really expensive, and they don't necessarily want to drag their $10,000, $30,000 bow and damage it on the strings. Then they either bring a cheap bow, or at sessions, I think for col legno, they often also just use pencils or something, or some other wood device to achieve col legno, just to not damage their bows. So give them a heads up if you're going to be doing that. And then once you're done with whatever special bowing you chose, don't forget to insert normal or natural or whatever language you want to use, something to indicate that now you want just regular bowing again. Let's get to articulations, because the strings have a ton of different articulations. So first things first, you can play any line non-vibrato, which basically means you're just pressing down the string, but you're not moving that hand on the fingerboard, which just creates a very flat, even sound. You can play vibrato, which means you're slightly moving that finger that is pressing down the string, and it creates a slight pitch vibration. And then you have espressivo, which basically is a very exaggerated form of vibrato. It goes back, I would say, to Romanticism, to that period of time when everything was a little bit exaggerated and very emotional. So, that's an indication you can use as well if you want really, really intense vibrato. And when you play a line, you can play non-legato, which basically means the notes that are played are getting a new bow stroke every single time. Then you have détaché, which is a very special form of non-legato. It means that every note that you play changes bow direction. In regular non-legato, you can play non-legato in the same bow direction. You don't have to change the direction every time. So if something is marked détaché, it means on every note change the bow direction. And if you indicate punta d'arco on top of détaché, you can actually get like a really nice, delicate sound, because it means that they're gonna play détaché but with the tip of the bow. So it's a nice effect. Then they can of course play legato, which means a line is played under the same bow stroke and there's no interruption between the notes. It's kind of similar to when wind instruments play legato, they play a line on one breath without an interruption, without a new breath or a new tongue stroke. It's just one long line. Basically the same for string players, except instead of under one breath, it's under one bow. Then you have portamento, which is a form of legato. It's like a very exaggerated legato. It's like a very, very quick glissando between two notes, often reserved for a dramatic moment with like a big note jump or something. It's not necessarily something the players will do just by themselves naturally, unless it's like solo literature and the soloist can make those choices. But as a section, they would not do that unless you indicate it or you tell them at the session, hey, can we have this thing portamento? It's not necessarily used all that much, especially not in modern film scores. And then of course you have glissando, which is a note transition that is just a very exaggerated slide, a very even slide. And you can achieve that. There's fingered glissando and there's also just the slide on the fingerboard, of course. But that has limitations because there's only so many pitches you can reach on one string. But professional players can actually kind of fake glissando in a way that it still sounds like a continuous glissando, but they can, switch between strings and kind of sneak their way through it. Another playing technique is portato, or louré in French. This is a very weird in-between articulation where there's just a very slight separation between notes as the players drag the bow across the string. It's more like it's very hard to describe. But yeah, it's a very light separation. It's like an almost legato. Then you have staccato, which refers to short separated notes. And this is an on-the-string articulation, meaning the bow remains on the string. And it's usually reserved for moderate tempo or slow tempo, because in fast tempo you actually can't do that, because then it automatically turns into spiccato. Spiccato is something that naturally happens at fast tempo, because when you play short notes, at a fast tempo, the bow will naturally start bouncing off the string. Like there's not much that you can do about that. That's just a natural thing that spontaneously happens. And you automatically get spiccato. You can also play spiccato at a slower tempo, but then the player has to make an actual effort to lift the bow off the string or to make it bounce off the string. So spiccato is actually what we refer to as an off-the-string articulation. Then we have marcato or martelé, which is a very heavy accented bow stroke, similar to sforzando, and this is also an on-the-string articulation, so you don't bounce. Then we have jeté or ricochet. It's a technique where you throw the bow onto the strings, usually in a downward motion, but you can also do it the other way around. And that will make the bow bounce, and it'll create several rapid pitches after one another. Then we have one of my favorites, which is arpeggiando. It's basically the bow is dragged across 3 or 4 strings to play an arpeggio, and this can technically happen in a legato fashion or in a staccato fashion, but if you speed it up, you get that spiccato effect again, where the bow naturally starts to bounce across the strings and bounce away, and then you get the arpeggiando effect. Then we have trills. This usually refers to only a minor second or major second. or half step, whole step, depending on what you want to call it. Basically just two quickly alternating pitches. And then you have something similar, which is tremolo, of course, which refers to either a repeated note that is, rebowed all the time in a rapid pace, or tremolo can also mean anything higher than a second, so thirds and upwards, and you tremolo between those two notes back and forth. Some sample libraries also refer to this as extended trills. I mean, you can call it whatever you want, but it's basically the point of both trills and tremolos is that you have quickly repeating or alternating pitch between two notes. But the general gist of trills and trems is that you have either quickly repeating notes or quickly alternating notes. Then you have pizzicato, normally played with the right hand. So this is not a bowed articulation. It's where you basically pluck the string with your right hand. Or there's also left hand pizzicato, but that's normally reserved for solo literature. It's definitely something special. I would not just regularly put that into my sessions. But, you can if you want. Just make sure there's enough time, because they do need a second to transition from, if they've just been doing a bowed articulation and they go into pizzicato, it does take them a moment to switch. And it also takes a moment to switch back. Not long, but just, make room for that. They can't seamlessly switch from one to the other. Then there's Bartok pizzicato, which basically means you pull the string and you snap it against the fingerboard. It's a very loud percussive thing to do. Very avant-garde in a way. Then you have con Sordino, which means with mute. That means the players will put a small plastic, wood, or metal device onto the bridge, which then absorbs a portion of the vibrations. And it creates this really silky, smooth, soft sound. Again, also with this articulation, make sure there's enough time for them to actually do that. In sessions, sometimes we just pause the take, they adjust, then we record the Sordino passage, and then we pause again. We just punch in for that section. But in a live context, but ideally also during a session, if you can plan it in a way where there's enough time for them. Again, it doesn't take long for them to do that, but they do need a second or two to do it. And the same happens in the reverse as well. They do need a moment to take it off. And then when you don't want them to play with mutes anymore, you have to write down senza Sordino into the score so they know when to take off the mute. Then we have harmonics. Harmonics are produced just like on any other string instrument really, by lightly placing the finger onto the string, but not pressing it down. You just lightly touch it, and then it'll produce, in this case when you bow it, it'll produce one of the upper harmonics. There are so-called natural harmonics. Those are the harmonics you can naturally produce on the open strings. So where you just have to lightly touch the string in specific spots to achieve the, upper harmonics. And then there are so-called artificial harmonics, because you need to access the other harmonics as well, the other pitches that you can't reach with the open strings. And those require two fingers. It basically means you push down the string with one finger in order to create a new bass pitch for the string. And then you touch it with another finger lightly to create the harmonic of that new pitch. There are different ways to notate them. We're not really on the same page about that. So I don't really know what to tell you about that. I've seen so many different ways of how harmonics have been written down. It's always confusing, so yeah, welcome to that world. So you can see there's a huge amount of combinations that you can achieve with all of this. You can combine different bowing techniques with different bow placements, with different finger techniques, or extensions like mutes. There's a huge amount of combinations that you can try, and it all creates a different color every single time, which makes the string section so versatile and so interesting, and also so hard to sample. There's just too many variations. There's too many things to cover. There's a lot more you can learn about these instruments, of course. This was just a quick rundown of the string section. They've also developed throughout history, which is very interesting. in terms of how classical instruments, for example, were built and how the bows differed and why classical music sounds the way it sounds and why the sound changed over the centuries. So if you want to learn more about that, I mean, the internet is at your disposal, and books and documentaries and everything. So have fun.